You mulligan
1,
before.
2, 3, 4, 5, 6.
He hits the right of flame.
And you gotta flip it though. No peeking. I gotta see too.
Slam it.
Welcome to the world of Magic the Gathering, a game where players take on the role of powerful wizards, casting spells and summoning creatures to defeat their opponents. One of the most popular archetypes in the game is known as Blue-White Control, a strategy that has been around as long as the game itself and has undergone many changes since its conception. Join me on a leisurely stroll through the history and evolution of Blue-White Control.
Well, kind of. It's actually more of a self-indulgent video essay of me gushing about my favorite deck of all time, craftily disguised as a history lesson. Before we can gush too much, we have some setup to do for those newer to the game. In order to properly understand what a control deck does, we first need to inject a little context. Archetypes.
There are a multitude of archetypes you can play in Magic the Gathering's competitive formats. You have decks that aim to win as early as possible before allowing their opponents to set up defenses by attacking with cheap, effective creatures and using pump spells or burn spells to get the job done. This is the aggro or aggressive archetype, and while aggro decks can come in all colors, the best ones tend to be in red or white. After that, you have decks that neglect to cast creatures in the early game in order to cast removal spells and ramp spells. Then, once they're in the mid game, they play planeswalkers and creatures that tend to outvalue the smaller, more efficient threats seen in aggressive decks, taking over the game. This is the mid-range archetype, and it comes in almost every color combination imaginable, though Jund, the combination of red, black, and green, is history's favorite. You even have decks that aim to win by using just 2 or 3 cards that, when combined, win the game instantly. We call these combo decks, and when a combo deck's win rate gets too high, it tends to get a ban. Sorry, Splinter Twin. We could do a whole video on the complexities of how different archetypes interact with each other, how mid-range tends to beat aggro, or how combo beats mid-range. But that's not why we're here.
Control. An archetype for the sadistic, aims to drag its opponents deep into the late game, where their fragile creatures lack strength, and any spells they manage to resolve cease to have an impact. Winning is not the goal of a control deck, but a byproduct. The only true goal is to stop the opposition from winning by countering their spells and removing their threats. Once we've cut our opponent's path to victory off, we can win in any fashion we see fit.
Historically, control decks can come in a variety of color combinations, though they almost always include blue, which serves 2 main purposes: counter magic and card advantage. Card advantage is one of the oldest and most important concepts in competitive Magic, and can be defined as any process by which a player obtains effectively more cards than their opponent. There are many ways to gain card advantage in Magic the Gathering. It would require a separate video to explore all of them. Lucky for us, Control gains its card advantage in an incredibly intuitive way, by drawing extra cards. One of the first known examples of a control deck was Zach Dolan's Angel Stasis, a blue-white deck splashing green that he used to win the first World Championship held in Milwaukee on the 21st of August, 1994. Looking at Dolan's list, we can immediately identify prime examples of both card advantage and counter magic. Ancestral Recall. An instant for 1 blue allows the user to draw 3 cards at the expense of 1 card. This wonderfully illustrates how one could develop card advantage through the use of blue spells. Unfortunately, you won't be seeing anyone cast this card in a competitive environment, as it has been banned in nearly every format. We also have Mana Drain, an instant for 2 blue mana that counters target spell, and then gives you colorless mana equal to the countered spell's mana cost on your next main phase. This is perhaps the most hyperbolic example of a counterspell I could give you, as not only does this counter any spell, a phenomenal effect for the low price of 2 mana, but it gives you a massive mana advantage on the following turn. Card draw and counter magic are wonderful, but they're only half of the equation. What happens when our opponent manages to resolve a creature while we're tapped out? If our only tools are counter magic and card draw, then even a lowly grizzly bear could kill us, given enough time. The astute of you will have already noticed Dolan's list contains very little counter magic, just 1 copy of Mana Drain, but that doesn't mean the deck was unequipped to deal with threats. Rather than trying to counter every spell that his opponents played, Dolan took the approach of removing threats when necessary, and he chose white to fulfill that role. Swords to Plowshares. An instant for 1 white allows the user to exile any creature in play, and in exchange, the controller of that creature gains life equal to the exiled creature's power. This is a prime example of single target removal, one of white's many functions. Using a card like Swords to Plowshares to remove an opponent's creature is what's known as a 1-for-1 interaction. I trade my 1 interactive spell for your single creature. If we played the entirety of the game in this fashion, we would eventually fall behind. This is due to the nature of threats versus answers. In any given format, we will have a limited number of single target removal spells that we can play, and that number will almost always be less than the amount of threats that our opponent can have in their deck. So as the game goes on, our opponent will continue to draw their threats, and if they resolve one while we don't have the answer, that threat could kill us. Card advantage and single target removal have incredible synergy. If we cast a card like Ancestral Recall after a 1-for-1 interaction has taken place, the likelihood that we can continue to deal with our opponent's threats skyrockets, leaving you with access to far more resources than your opponent, granting you inevitability, the true win condition of a good control deck. White can also give us a slightly less intuitive, but potentially more powerful version of card advantage. Wrath of God, a sorcery for 2 white and 2 generic, destroys all creatures in play. Cards with this effect are affectionately referred to as board wipes, and when you use such a card to remove 2 or more permanents on your opponent's side of the battlefield, you have gained card advantage in the form of a 2-for-1. One of my cards for 2 of yours.
Dolan's World Championship list gives us a first good look at how control decks work, at least on a rudimentary level. Counter spells, kill threats, and don't let your opponent have any fun. The main win condition in this list happens to be Serra Angel, which was a huge threat back in its day. Playing the Vigilant 4/4 flyer was somewhat of a tradition among control players in the early years of Magic.
Fast forward to 1996. The internet is still in its adolescent stage, and information about deck lists and card choices can be difficult to come by. Enter Brian Weissman, a well-respected contributor to Magic Theory and professional at the game. Here, we see a relic of history known as the deck, one of Weissman's own creations. The list earned its name not only because it was one of the first decks to ever be widely shared on the chat boards and metagame blogs of the early internet, but also because it was said to have had no bad matchups. Looking through the list, we can see it isn't a pure blue-white deck, rather a 4-color deck that is strongly rooted in blue and white. However, there are many similarities between this list and Dolan's Angel Stasis. We still see the use of Serra Angel as the main win condition, and Swords to Plowshares as the premier single-target removal spell. We can also see Weissman has opted to include a full playset of Mana Drain in addition to 2 copies of Counterspell, far more counter magic than we saw in Dolan's list. As you'll see in a few moments, Weissman's list reflects more closely the control decks we play in the modern day, less win conditions and more interaction. I invite you to delve into both Dolan and Weissman's lists once we're done here. The use of both Stasis and Moat as a means to slow the game down are fascinating, and the effects granted by the splash colors in both decks are certainly worth looking into.
Now that we've had a look through both of these ancient piles of cards, we actually have most of the information needed to understand the anatomy of a well-constructed control deck. We play the game of attrition. Counter magic, single target removal, and board wipes are used to deny our opponents threats and resources, while we accumulate resources of our own through card advantage. And then, once the opponent is fully immobilized, we kill him with a big white fatty. We aren't going to spend all our time here discussing lists from ancient history. The only thing we're really missing out on are different cards that play the same role as cards we've already looked at. Many of you are already aware that old decks played Force of Will, a very effective counterspell. Maybe the best counterspell of all time. And the scholars of you probably know that some decks even played Millstone as a win condition, which in a control deck functions basically the same as Serra Angel, except it won't die to your board wipes. Remember, once our opponents are fully immobilized, we can use whatever we want to get the job done. With our newfound knowledge of the Archetypes roots, we're now going to time skip 17 years into the future to 2013. Don't worry, we aren't forgetting about our good old buddy Jace the Mind Sculptor. When he showed up on the scene in 2010, he was immediately drafted into the Call Go and Call Blade archetypes, and that's a topic for a different video. He does eventually find his true home in control decks later down the line, but we'll get to that in a bit.
2011 was the year I started playing competitive Magic, and at the time, Standard was the premier format. Modern wouldn't hit the scene for another couple of months, and Extended was long dead at the shops I was playing at. I remember struggling to find an identity within the game. Nothing I played felt quite right. But a year later, in 2012, a new set would come out, Return to Ravnica. This turned out to be quite the development for Control Mages, as in this set we received a myriad of new control staples. We are now looking at a more recent example of a blue-white control deck. This is William Jensen's take on the archetype, and he used this standard deck to take second place at Grand Prix Dallas in 2013. This list shares no cards with the list we studied previously in the video, which makes perfect sense as it's nearly 2 decades younger and is constructed for a completely different format. But the game theory behind its construction is very similar. Where Weissman's deck played 4 mana drains and 2 counterspell for a total of 6 blue permission cards, Jensen's deck played 4 dissolve and 2 syncopate, the best counterspells in the format at that time. Swords to Plowshares has not been legal in Standard since the 90s. In lieu of this, Jensen played 4 copies of Azorius Charm. At first glance, it might be difficult to see the similarities between Swords and Charm. The Charm doesn't permanently remove the threat like Swords does, rather it temporarily disposes a creature for 1 turn. However, in return for the weaker removal effect, we are granted modality. Azorius Charm has 3 modes to choose from. You can draw a card, give your creature's lifelink, or put an attacking or blocking creature on top of its owner's library. In Jensen's list, the lifelink mode on Azorius Charm doesn't come up often, but in the event our opponent doesn't have a creature to remove, we can simply replace the charm with another card by casting it for its card draw ability, meaning Azorius Charm is never stuck in our hand when we don't need it. Divination, a sorcery for 1 blue and 2 generic, draws the user 2 cards. While this is certainly no Ancestral Recall, it is a more modern version of Card Advantage. Jensen's list is quite focused on maintaining card advantage over its opponents. We can see that outlined clearly by the inclusion of a playset of Sphinx's Revelation, an instant that costs 2 blue, 1 white, and X, and reads, "You gain X life and draw X cards." With this card alone, we can see how this deck wants games to play out. As the game goes longer, we can cast our Sphinx's Revelation for more and more mana. Every turn we survive is another land drop, another mana for Revelations. Once we start resolving Sphinx's Revelation for 5 or more at the end of our opponent's turn, the game is basically over. The opponent can choose to keep playing, but our hand is full of card draw and interaction. It's only a matter of time before we win the game. Further examination of the list reveals some of the best control staples from Return to Ravnica. Detention Sphere, an enchantment for a blue, a white, and a generic, exiles any non-land permanent we like. This effect was powerful enough at the time that it was common to play a full playset in your control deck. Another card that Jensen is playing 4 of is Supreme Verdict, a sorcery for 2 white, 1 blue, and a generic that reads Destroy all creatures. This spell cannot be countered. As I mentioned before, board wipes can act as a type of card advantage, meaning nearly half of the spells in Jensen's deck serve to keep him ahead on resources. Another interesting thing we can see here is the utter lack of win conditions. The closest thing to a Serra Angel in this list is Elspeth Sun's Champion, a 6-mana planeswalker that can fill the role of both a board wipe and a win condition. While Elspeth is quite flexible, she is also too fragile to be the only win condition in the deck. If she is removed, the only things left that can deal damage are 2 copies of Mutavault. This is my favorite part, where it all comes full circle. Inevitability is a word you'll hear a lot when discussing control and Magic. Many of you already noted this single copy of Elixir of Immortality in the list. This card is a testament to just how inevitable this deck is. Its effect is simple. It's just a 1-mana artifact that gains you life and shuffles itself along with your graveyard into your library. Why does that matter? Well, if our Elspeth and Mutavaults all get dealt with, we can put them back into our deck and eventually find them again by either naturally drawing them or casting a huge Sphinx's Revelation. This means we will always be able to kill our opponents, even if we have to deal with every threat in their deck before doing so. Chances are, our opponent will lose by drawing their whole deck before we can actually kill them. But that's the beauty. As long as we can get into the late game, victory is inevitable. Decks like Jensen's were the pinnacle of control in Standard for as long as Return to Ravnica was legal. As new sets came out, we saw players splashing colors for different effects, but in that era, Supreme Verdict and Sphinx's Revelation were at the center of every control deck. In 2015, Dragons of Tarkir brought us Esper Dragons, a blue, black, and white deck that used Dragon Lord Ojutai as its primary win condition. It saw some success and is close enough to a blue-white control deck to get a mention here, though we won't be diving into the list. If you're interested, I left it for you in the description below. While all of this was happening in Standard, Modern was shaping up to become quite the format. Everything from fast aggressive decks, efficient combo decks, and yes, even control decks were seeing play. In 2014, Shaun McLaren won Pro Tour Born of the Gods with a modern blue, white, and red control deck. We won't spend too much time on this list as control decks in this period of Modern varied quite a bit. Hold for the splash of red for direct damage effects, this deck follows the same game theory that we've previously established. Plenty of removal and counter magic, and a good amount of card draw. This list doesn't play as many board wipes as Jensen's, but that has a lot to do with the metagame of the time. We see some treasures we missed out on during our time skip, like a Johnny Vengeant, a planeswalker for a red, a white, and 2 colorless that can keep permanents from untapping, deal damage and gain life, or even destroy all of its opponent's lands, a nice mana denial effect that might remind some of Stasis from Dolan's Angel Stasis deck. We also see Path to Exile, a fixed version of the overpowered Swords to Plowshares, and Cryptic Command, a highly modal counterspell that defined modern control decks at the time. Thanks to all the cheap interaction, this deck gets to play Snapcaster Mage, a creature that allows you to recast spells from your graveyard, giving you extra ways to spend mana and disrupt your opponent's game plan. And then finally, if you look at the mana base, we see one of my old favorites, Celestial Colonnade. Why waste slots on win conditions when you can hide them in your mana base for free?
Modern control decks like McLaren's were the norm for quite some time, but as threats became more powerful and decks became more efficient, control began to lose its footing. Something we haven't touched on up to this point in the video is threat assessment, a fundamental part of the game that every aspiring control player needs to master. In most games of Magic the Gathering, we won't be able to counter every single threat our opponents play, and in many cases, we'll need to let a threat linger on the battlefield for a turn or two before removing it. Let's say we're playing 6 pieces of counter magic in our control deck. That would mean we could expect to have about 1 piece of counter magic in an opening hand. Now our opponent is very likely going to try to curve out or spend all of their available mana on every single turn. Back in the early days of Modern, not all threats were created equal, meaning you could allow the weaker ones to resolve and save your counterspells for the stronger ones. But that only works if there's a substantial delta between our opponent's weakest and strongest threats. As the density of strong threats rose higher and higher with the fire design of Magic's recent sets, Control's interaction was stretched thin. This issue reached an apex when the first Modern Horizons expansion came out in June of 2019. The threats in this set were too much for Control decks to handle. The aggro decks were too fast, and the combo decks were too flexible. It's not like Control wasn't getting any new cards either. In 2018, we saw both the unbanning of Jace the Mind Sculptor and the printing of the standard menace known as Teferi, Hero of Dominaria.
Here we have Oliver II's blue-white control deck that secured him a second-place finish at Grand Prix Providence in August of 2018. The anatomy of this list continues to follow the formula we've previously established. We see counter magic in the form of Disallow, Essence Scatter, and Syncopate, along with a single copy of both Commit to Memory and Negate, giving us a staggering 11 pieces of permission. To support these counterspells, we have our usual single target removal in the form of Cast Out and Seal Away. While these may look a bit different from the instant speed spell-based removal we've seen in previous decks, these enchantments still do a fine job removing threats on a one-for-one basis. And in the event any threats were able to sneak past our interaction, we have Settle the Wreckage, a 4-mana white instant that exiles all attacking creatures and lets the opponent tutor a basic land into play tapped for each creature exiled this way. Something important to note here is that Settle the Wreckage doesn't provide us card advantage in the same way that more traditional board wipes do, as when we cast it, it replaces every threat we removed with another card, effectively leaving our opponents with the same number of cards as they started with, while we're -1 card. Though being an instant speed spell has its advantages. If we cast Wrath of God in our main phase, we will usually tap out to do so, meaning our opponent can freely resolve whatever threats they like after we pass the turn. Any particularly skilled opponent will be well aware of that cadence and optimize their play to take advantage of it by playing 1 or 2 of their threats and holding their best one until after we've tapped out. Cards like Settle the Wreckage flip that cadence on its head by allowing us to deal with threats on the opponent's turn and then on tap, play a land, and pass, representing a plethora of counter magic and removal to be used on the opponent's following turn. All of that is to say that while Settle the Wreckage doesn't fill the card advantage role, it does provide us with an important tempo advantage, but that topic is for a future video. 2's deck keeps to the control blueprint and opts to play very few win conditions. We see 2 Torrential Gearhulks, a more modernized take on Snapcaster Mage that, if left unchecked, can end the game on its own. However, when you consider that Oliver's list contains only 2 creatures, and most self-respecting competitive lists play more than 2 pieces of removal, we can see how fragile these Gearhulks are. It doesn't help that they are artifacts in addition to being creatures, meaning that a much wider array of interactive cards can answer this threat. Teferi, Hero of Dominaria, is the ultimate Swiss Army knife for decks like 2's, with a +1 that gives us card advantage, a -3 that gives us a repeatable source of single target removal, and an ultimate that grants us access to one of the most sadistic, grindy win conditions Control has ever seen. For those unfamiliar, here's how we win with Teferi. Step 1 is to get our Teferi to 8 loyalty by activating its +1 4 times. Normally, this is incredibly difficult to do as Planeswalkers tend to get attacked aggressively in order to stop them from using their most powerful loyalty abilities. Unfortunately for our opponent, Teferi gives us both extra cards and mana when we tick him up, meaning we will have access to more resources than usual to protect him. Once at 8 loyalty, we use the last ability, which gives us an emblem that says, whenever you draw a card, exile target permanent an opponent controls. Notably, this text does not exclude lands. We then spend the next few turns drawing cards and exiling every single permanent our opponent controls. Once we've halted the game to a standstill, we cast another copy of Teferi. This is where it gets dark. If we read Teferi's -3 ability, we see that it can put any target non-land permanent 3 cards deep into its owner's library, including himself. For the rest of the game, we will draw at the beginning of the turn, exiling any permanent our opponent manages to put into play. Then, if we have Teferi, we play it at -3, targeting that same Teferi, putting it back into our library. 3 turns later, we will draw it and repeat the process. This means that we can't draw our whole deck, as we can always put Teferi back into it, and our opponent can never take a game action again, hold for losing the game after drawing their last card.
It would take Teferi quite some time to see play in Modern. As powerful as the Planeswalker is, it's still a 5-mana sorcery speed investment that would often get stuck in your hand while your opponents pummeled you with hyper-efficient threats. And thanks to sets like Modern Horizons 1, we had to deal with cards like Ren and 6, a 2-mana Planeswalker that would threaten to outgrind us if left unchecked. Decks were simply too diverse and efficient for control decks to handle. We needed more flexible answers to compete in such a high-power and diverse environment. As we've delved through these lists, you may have noticed a trend setting in. As time goes on, cards seem to do more and more. We see control decks adopting the use of Planeswalkers and other modal spells like Cryptic Command and Azorius Charm. Well, it turns out all control needed to make its triumphant comeback was a patch update, and over the next couple of years, we got just that.
Here it is. This is what the modern blue-white control decks of today look like. A wonderful medley of modal interaction, high-power planeswalkers, and efficient card advantage. Modern Horizons 2 brought us Solitude, a 5-mana 3/2 with lifelink and flash that casts Swords to Plowshares on a creature when it enters the battlefield, and if that weren't strong enough, you can cast it for free by pitching another white card in your hand. You will have to sacrifice Solitude when you cast it this way, but that's a small price to pay for what is effectively a combination of Swords to Plowshares, Force of Will, and Serra Angel.
Okay, so it's not actually a Serra Angel, but you get the idea. It's a 5-mana white creature we can use to win the game. Notably, Solitude is also an elemental, meaning we get to play a companion.
Kahira the Orphan Guard is a 3-mana 3/2 you can play as a companion as long as every creature in your deck is either a cat, an elemental, or 3 other creature types we do not care about because we only play elementals. This means that in a pinch, we can buy our companion and then discard it to evoke our Solitude, saving our more impactful white cards for later in the game. Cards like Leyline Binding, an instant speed Oblivion Ring effect that costs 1 less for each basic land type we control, which is usually all 5 thanks to the combination of Triumphs and fetch lands we get to play, reducing the cost of binding to 1 white mana. You know what else sometimes costs 1 white mana? Prismatic Ending, a sorcery speed removal spell that can remove any non-land permanent, provided we have access to colored mana equal to the target's mana cost. We also see substantial upgrades in our counter magic. We haven't yet covered it in this video, but the titular counterspell, known as Counterspell, wasn't actually legal in Modern for most of the format's existence. But Modern Horizons 2 spoiled us again, and gave us the reprint that would make Counterspell Modern legal. To go with our playset of counterspells, Modern Horizons 1 gave us Archmage's Charm, a combination of Counterspell, Divination, and a mini Threads of Disloyalty. This modal instant is strong enough that most modern control decks play a full playset of the card. Further inspection of this deck reveals an utter lack of 1-mana spells, something other decks in the format are full of. Chalice of the Void isn't a new card, but thanks to the current configuration of modern control decks, we can play Chalice for either 1 or 0 without affecting our deck's game plan whatsoever. In some matchups, like Hammer Time or Blue-Red Murktide, we can play Chalice on 1 and lock them out of the game completely thanks to their density of 1-mana spells. In combo matchups, like Temur Rhinos or Living End, we can play Chalice on 0, which will counter their 0-mana payoffs, rendering their decks useless for as long as Chalice remains in play. We even get to play Jace the Mind Sculptor, a previously banned card that provides card advantage, temporary removal, resource denial, and a win condition, all in one card. Today's modern control decks tend to look quite similar to the one we've just examined, though thanks to the multitude of options we now have, there's often some variance. Some lists opt to play Teferi, Hero of Dominaria, rather than the Shark Typhoon seen in the previous deck. Some trim copies of Leyline Binding for other flexible selections like Fire Ice. People have even been seen playing 1 or 2 copies of Subtlety, the blue Evoke elemental that stifles a creature or planeswalker for a turn, buying the controller enough time to resolve a planeswalker of their own. Unfortunately, that's all I have for you today. Hopefully you've enjoyed our brief walk through the evolution and history of blue-white control. For those interested, I've left links to both my personal blue-white deck and all the lists that we've examined throughout this video in the description for you. Thank you so much for watching, and as always, I'll see you next time.